You're very welcome to this video about moral equivalence, about what to say, think, do, feel when somebody says, yes, Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022, but we depending on where you are in the world, we invaded Iraq in 2003. How do you react to this? And what I want to do is have this conversation, of course, in the light of George W. Bush making this slip of the tongue when he said that there's this brutal and unjustified invasion of Ukraine. And then he, laughing under his breath, said Iraq too. So let's talk about this. And what I want to do is not tell you what you should think about it, but kind of imagine that your view about how you would compare the Iraq war and the Ukraine war is a kind of a metaphorical room in your house. And with your permission, and if you don't want to give me permission, just jump to another video. With your permission, I want to come into that room and just talk with you briefly about maybe rearranging the furniture, moving the table a little bit, moving the chair a little bit. And I'm going to get out of your hair. And at the end, you can just put everything back to where it was. Or move it slightly, if you feel that's needed. So that's the kind of approach I want to take to how we respond to different kinds of evils and evaluate them ethically and politically. So I think to start with, it's important to make a distinction between the regime and the leader of the regime. And sometimes they are, if not the same, then in the same kind of boat ethically, but not always. For instance, it's completely consistent to think that Stalin was more evil than Hitler, but that Nazi Germany was a more evil regime than Stalin's Russia. You don't have to think that, but that's a consistent position to take. So there is the regime and the degree to which it's evil. Then there is the leader and the degree to which they are as an individual evil. And then there is the third bit, which is the decision. How evil is the decision itself, which of course ethically colors the leader and the regime, but nevertheless, it's worth keeping these three very, very connected things to some degree distinct. And then there is something fourth that appears only in rare cases, and it doesn't have a place in Iraq, in that Iraq war, but it has a very small place, or you might say a medium-sized place, in the Ukraine invasion that Putin's done. And that's a kind of stepping out of morality, that some evil that's done is accompanied by a discourse that's a way of stepping out, not just in practice, but in principle, out of moral life. And that happens when a discourse appears that basically says that some human beings just have no moral significance at all. I don't think that discourse occurred in the Soviet Union. The extermination, the torture, the incarceration were justified in other ways, in terms of suffering and bloodbaths that are necessary on the way to some ever perfect future. But the discourse in Nazi Germany was that some human beings just don't count ethically. And there was a semblance of that being introduced by elements of the Russian propaganda machine in the Ukraine war. And that's why I want to put this on the table, because there was a hint of a discourse about the correct and the incorrect kind of Ukrainians. So I want to put that on the table. I then want to say something really simple and really basic about consequence and intent. We've got to count how many people died, how many people were killed, and we've got to look at how directly or indirectly they were killed too. And that's not always straightforward. Imagine that somebody is a young woman living in Mariupol. Imagine she's 36. She escapes to Germany. But 4 years later, she dies from cancer. Because of the stress of the blockade of Mariupol, or because of some exposure to war toxins and chemicals, that's not disconnected. That's a casualty, not disconnected from the war. Or imagine another counting challenge. So you certainly blame Hitler and the Nazi regime for everybody that they killed. Do you blame them for every single soldier that died in the war because they started the war? Yes. But what's the extent of responsibility here, and how is it different to their responsibility for people who were directly killed? So, how many are killed? How directly they are killed? What is the motivation for them being killed? And particularly with the most ghastly sort of killing of civilians, it's always worth asking, how vertical is this? I mean, for instance, is what happened in Bucha something that's a product of drug taking and drunkenness and social alienation and dislocation and class envy and fear and whatever? Or is it a command from the top? So that makes a very significant difference. There is also an us and them distinction that's worth putting on the table. And there is a good side to it, or a kind of perfectly understandable side to it, and a questionable side. The questionable side to it is a kind of racism that means we just stop caring about people unless they're white, for example. But you can't reduce differentials in ethical regard just to that. I mean, for example, it's legitimate for Europeans to be pissed off about a war in Europe because they're Europeans, just like it's legitimate for me to be pissed off about a fire in my building as opposed to a building one block down the road. So there is also a question about what is our position vis-a-vis what is happening, and is the war that's happening to some degree an attack on us, or is it an attack by someone or by us on a country, on a group of human beings that have got nothing to do with us at all, except that they're human and that human lives matter. So this is significant. And of course, part of the outrage about the Ukraine war is that Europeans feel that these sorts of things shouldn't be done in Europe. Europeans actually are naive because they don't just think that. They think that such things aren't going to be done in Europe once history establishes itself and realigns itself to its normal path. That's an illusion. In the future, major European powers will go to war. Western European countries will be at war with each other in the future. But not in the near future, but in the future, because human beings make war. But Europeans have a right to say, well, we don't like this, especially because this is happening in Europe and this is our home and we don't tolerate wars here. There is a challenging side here, which is that, the destruction of Aleppo, as a great war journalist friend of mine once said in one of her reports, that the destruction of Aleppo is as great a loss to human culture as the destruction of Paris and Rome. But there we go. Us and them is a distinction that has a place here. And then I wanted to say something about stupidity. Some evil isn't stupid at all. It's terrifyingly effective and calculated. I would put the terrorist attack of September 11th under that category. It's evil that's done with great skill and imagination. But a lot of evil is done with a great dose of stupidity involved. We're going to come a bit more to the stupidity of the Iraq war because I've got a personal story to tell you about that. But the stupidity of Putin's invasion of Ukraine is palpable because there is this missing picture of what Ukraine is really like. I mean, we could send a 12-year-old to any town in Ukraine, even the more pro-Russian ones, on a weekend holiday before the war, and they'd come back and convincingly explain to us how Ukrainians feel, and there really is they wouldn't use that language, but there is something like a new, an anti-colonialist movement in Ukraine. It's clear that Ukraine was going to fight back, inevitably fight back, whatever we in Western Europe and in North America did. And the thing about stupidity is that it can sometimes obstruct our evaluation of why a decision is made, because we just become dismissive of the decision-making process. And it's important that that doesn't happen, not just for our ethical evaluation, but for our realistic evaluation of something, because we don't want to be too flippant about why highly intelligent people in certain decision-making and institutional and historical moments make very, very stupid decisions. Because if we just say it's stupidity, we miss out on a three-dimensional picture, which is a prerequisite for the right kind of ethical evaluation anyway. And in this light, I want to mention that we need an understanding of the historical and institutional context. The decisions don't occur in a vacuum. And let us say the prime minister of a liberal democracy in Western Europe in 2022 making a decision is very different to a general secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union making a decision in 1960. These are different dynamics, different processes. And it's also very important, I think, to mention perhaps one specific thing about what it means to be sort of bought in like this into an institutional context. And that's that sometimes people make decisions they don't necessarily agree with because they think that there's a kind of inevitability to things going in that direction. That's where, to some extent, Tony Blair was caught in the run-up to the Iraq War, when Tony Blair, the prime minister of this country at the time, for reasons that we'll actually break down at some point, but for reasons that have elements of boldness and grandiosity and messianic dimensions too, felt that the US would go anyway without the UK, and the UK going would make the path of the US better. It would make the war less bad if the UK was involved. And that was one of the many forms of delusion and deceit that drove Britain to join the war. So we've got to be always curious about the complex texture of historical and institutional context. And before I end with a little story, I want to just say something quickly about values. There's a risk that we end up thinking that the evil that's done in the world is done for reasons of positive aims and positive values, but very, very badly applied in practice. Everybody's trying to do the right thing, aren't they? And actually, no, they're not. Because yes, there are positive values, but there are also destructive values. There are negative values. Yes, human beings have ideas about justice, and very often a very, very bad kind of idea about justice can cause a great deal of pain and suffering and tragedy. But that'll still be an idea of justice, and it'll still be to do with trying to make the world a more rather than less just place. But you can't reduce all evil to misdirected expressions of the good. There is also destructive human capacities and dispositions, the desire to have somebody under your power, the desire to be cruel, various kinds of sadistic desires. All of that is part of being a human being, particularly a human being in power, and particularly a human being with unchecked power. So it's very important that we don't just reduce bad action to positive values poorly implemented in practice. And you often hear this sort of stuff when people say, well, yes, Vladimir Putin is very wrong, but he's just a patriot. So from his perspective, he's just doing the best for his country. No, he's not. No, he's not. I mean, if you said Vladimir Putin is a patriot, just like think of the country whose leadership you admire most of anybody in the world. Let's call that leader a patriot. That they are a patriot just like Vladimir Putin is. The difference that Putin has false views about what it means to be a patriot. No, sorry. There's also a lot else going on. There are destructive dispositions, destructive forces that drove him to do this Ukraine intervention. That's not to say that he isn't a patriot. It's rather to say that if you call the most noble human beings you can encounter patriots and you call Putin a patriot, you're running a concept of being a patriot that is so wide that it has zero explanatory power, because just about anything can fit through it. Story to finish. I don't do activism because I'm a philosopher. Philosophers don't do activism. Except a little bit of disability awareness and disability activism that I am involved in. But I did join the Stop the War Coalition in the run-up to the Iraq War around 2002. And I joined it because I thought the war was a particularly glaring and predictable disaster. And eventually I stopped doing things for the Stop the War Coalition because I found the pacifist messaging so prominent and just politically, farcically counterproductive. Of course, I'm not a pacifist, but forgetting that, just the very idea of saying that the Iraq war is a bad idea because all wars are wrong is just about the worst humanly possible argument you can make. And I was in rooms when that argument was made to people in positions of power, and I just wanted to disappear. But I went to see a prominent UK politician who was called Charles Clarke. He has very big ears. And he, at that time, wasn't Home Secretary, yet he was Secretary of Education. And we had a long conversation that I might misrepresent to you now because I lost the tape from it. So it was a small meeting, and in the course of that meeting, it was my impression, and I could be wrong, that this important politician ended up saying two incompatible things: that we needed to go to war in Iraq to stop Iraq from developing weapons of mass destruction and to stop Iraq from using weapons of mass destruction they had already developed. For a highly sophisticated political actor to make that kind of contradiction is a sign of the historically unique fatuousness and superficiality and awkwardness about how that war had to be justified by people participating in it. So I just wanted to share that. A quick personal remark, if you will allow me. My health has not been good recently. Even this conversation is a conversation in which I'm doing my best to focus on you, but sadly 70% of my energy is going on just keeping my symptoms under control and trying to not focus on the relatively high pain levels. And so that means that we have had less content on the main channel than we would like, and then the YouTube algorithm would like. The YouTube algorithm has been very upset about this recently because it likes regular content. But what I want to say is that my idea is to speak to you on the main channel more regularly than what's happening at the moment. And I want to thank you for your patience. And I want to say that I'm planning, health allowing, to release a video on Sunday with a very exciting and slightly unexpected new angle on all of the things we've been talking about. So fingers crossed, see you Sunday, and wishing you a very, very good couple of days. Lots of love, talk soon, and thank you for being part of this conversation.